the weight of silence. The concrete walls of Cell Block H had witnessed 43 deaths since Vincent "Vinnie" Torino arrived 8 years ago. He'd counted them all: overdoses, shankings, one man who simply stopped breathing in his sleep. Death was currency here, traded in whispers and settled scores. But what happened after Tank Washington's humiliation would make all those deaths seem like paperwork errors. Vinnie sat on his narrow cot, fingering the rosary his daughter had sent him before she disappeared into Witsec. The beads were worn smooth from 8 years of prayer, or what the other inmates assumed was prayer. In reality, each bead corresponded to a name, a debt, a thread in the web he'd been weaving since the day they locked him away. The bruise on his cheek had already faded. Tank's slap carried the weight of theater, not genuine violence. The real damage was in the message. The old Italian rat was fair game now. Vinnie had watched it ripple through the yard like blood in water. Conversations stopped when he passed. Eyes lingered a heartbeat too long. Even the Aryan Brotherhood shot callers started whispering. They thought Tank had broken some unspoken protection. They were wrong. Tank had broken something far more valuable, the carefully maintained illusion that Vincent Torino was harmless. Guard Captain Martinez made his evening rounds, keys jangling against his belt. He paused at Vinnie's cell, just long enough for their eyes to meet. A slight nod, nothing more. 8 years, and they'd perfected the art of invisible communication. Martinez had 3 kids in college and a mortgage in Colorado Springs. He also had an envelope that arrived monthly, always cash, always exactly enough to cover his daughter's medical bills. Lights out in 10, Torino. Martinez's voice carried just the right amount of institutional indifference. Yes, sir. The guard moved on, but not before dropping a folded newspaper outside Vinnie's cell. Page 6 would have a circled obituary, some nobody from Newark who died of natural causes. But the date would tell Vinnie everything he needed to know about Tank Washington's associates on the outside. 3 cells down, Tank was holding court. His voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never been truly challenged within these walls. He was explaining to his lieutenant, Jerome Ghost Walker, how disrespecting a mob turncoat would bring respect from the Mexicans, the Aryans, even the guards. "Old man's finished," Tank's voice echoed off the concrete. "Been walking around here like he still matters, like anybody gives a damn about some paisano who sold out his own blood." Vinnie almost smiled. Tank wasn't wrong about the selling out part. The difference was scale. Tank thought small: drugs, protection, the petty kingdom of ADX Florence. Vinnie had sold out 5 crime families to the FBI, while simultaneously selling out the FBI to those same families. The beautiful thing about playing all sides was that everyone thought they owned you. The newspaper obituary would confirm what Vinnie already suspected. Tank's nephew, Marcus Jr., was working construction in Baltimore. His sister Keisha just opened a beauty salon in Oakland. His mother lived alone in a rent-controlled apartment in Bed-Stuy, Building 4B, Apartment 3C. She fed stray cats and took the same route to church every Sunday morning. Tank Washington commanded respect through violence and reputation. Vincent Torino commanded something more powerful: information, patience, and a network of debts that stretched from these concrete walls to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The lights went out. In the darkness, Vinnie began counting rosary beads. Bead 1, Agent Sarah Chen, FBI task force leader who thought she was running an asset but was actually washing money through her husband's tech startup. Bead 2, Warden Phillips, whose gambling debts to the Torino family went back 15 years. Bead 3, Dr. Marcus Webb, the prison psychologist who'd been filing reports about Vinnie's deteriorating mental state, while those same reports allowed certain medications to be smuggled to specific inmates. By dawn, Tank Washington would discover that humiliating Vincent Torino was the worst decision he'd ever made. Not because Vinnie would retaliate directly, that wasn't how the game worked at his level, but because Tank had forced Vinnie to reveal that his 8 years of playing the broken old man wasn't protection, it was preparation. The rosary had 53 beads. Each one represented a person who owed Vincent Torino their career, their freedom, or their life. Tomorrow, he would start collecting. Tank thought he'd cornered a rat. What he'd actually done was wake up the man who'd spent 8 years turning America's most secure prison into his own private office. The only question now was, how many people would have to die before Tank understood the difference between a mob turncoat and a mob architect? Outside his cell window, Vinny could see the first hint of sunrise bleeding across the Colorado mountains. 71 hours remained until lockdown, until the FBI task force, until everyone realized they'd been guarding the wrong man all along. Time to make some phone calls. The architecture of memory. The first call would have to wait until morning rec time, but Vinny's mind was already 3 moves ahead as he watched the Colorado dawn paint his cell walls gold. 26 years ago, he'd made a promise to a dying man that would determine how the next 70 hours unfolded. His father, Anthony Old Tony Torino, had lasted 3 days after the cancer finally won. In those final moments, when the morphine couldn't touch the pain anymore, the old man had gripped Vinny's hand with surprising strength. "You listen to me, Vincent. This life, our life, it ain't about the money or the respect. It's about the people you can't let go. You protect what matters, no matter what it costs you. Everything else is just business." Old Tony died before dawn on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Vinny had already started building the network that would eventually swallow the entire East Coast operation. But the old man's words carved themselves into his chest like scar tissue, and for 8 years in ADX Florence, they'd been the only thing keeping him sane. What mattered was Isabella. His daughter's photograph was the only personal item allowed in his cell, a Polaroid from her 16th birthday, taken 3 months before the FBI raids that changed everything. She was wearing a yellow sundress, laughing at something his wife Maria had whispered in her ear. The corners were soft from handling, but her smile remained perfect. Isabella was 24 now, somewhere in Oregon, under a name he wasn't allowed to know. The WITSEC protocols were absolute. No contact, no letters, no confirmation she was even alive. The photograph was 8 years old, but it was all he had of the life that mattered beyond these walls. Tank Washington thought he'd found Vinny's weakness when his sources discovered Isabella's existence. What Tank didn't understand was the difference between a weakness and a weapon. Every man in ADX Florence had someone they protected. Wives, mothers, children, sisters. The smart ones kept those connections buried deep. The dead ones let their emotions show. Vinny had spent 8 years appearing to be the latter, while actually perfecting the former. The breakfast bell echoed through cell block H at 6:30, followed by the mechanical chunk of locks disengaging. Vinny rose from his cot with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to hide his true strength behind the performance of age. His back genuinely ached. Concrete mattresses for 8 years would break anyone's spine. But the shuffle he affected was pure theater. Guard Martinez appeared at his cell door with 2 newer officers Vinny didn't recognize. Fresh faces rotated through ADX Florence every few months, but the smart ones learned quickly that certain inmates required different handling. Martinez had been here long enough to understand that Vincent Torino's cooperation wasn't mandatory. It was purchased. "Morning, Torino. You've got a visitor request?" Vinny's expression didn't change, but his pulse quickened. Visitor requests were carefully choreographed events. His attorney, David Kellerman, only came when there was news about Isabella's security or updates from the outside that couldn't be transmitted through normal channels. What time? After Rec 10:30. The timing was perfect. Morning Rec would give him access to the phones, and Kellerman's visit would provide cover for information that needed to flow in both directions. Tank's humiliation had accelerated a timeline Vinny had hoped to stretch for another year, but adaptation was survival in both the mob and federal custody. Walking to the yard, Vinny passed Tank's cell. The gang leader was doing push-ups, his massive frame moving with the mechanical precision of a man who'd built his reputation on physical dominance. Tank's lieutenant, Ghost Walker, lounged on the opposite bunk, reading a letter from someone named Shanice, who apparently missed him something terrible. "Morning, old man," Tank called out as Vinny passed. His voice carried the casual cruelty of a predator who'd already marked his prey. "Sleep okay? I know how you old-timers get nervous about change." Vinny paused at the cell door, meeting Tank's eyes with the tired resignation Tank expected to see. "I slept fine, Marcus. Thank you for asking." Tank smiled. He'd been testing whether yesterday's humiliation had broken the last of Vinny's spirit. What he saw confirmed his assumptions, a broken old man trying to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable destruction. If Tank had been more observant, he might have noticed that Vinny was the only inmate in Cell Block H who used Tank's real name instead of his street name. He might have wondered how a mob turncoat knew details about Tank's background that weren't in his official file. He might have questioned why a man supposedly cut off from all outside contacts seemed to know exactly when guard rotations changed, when new inmates arrived, when federal task forces were scheduled to visit. But Tank Washington saw what Vinny wanted him to see, an old man clinging to outdated protocols of respect while the world moved on without him. By tonight, Tank would understand his mistake. The question was whether that understanding would come before or after the people he loved started disappearing.
The silence that followed Alessandro's words felt heavier than the ancient stones surrounding them. Through the phone, he could hear Marcus's breathing quicken, a sound that transported him instantly back to that cramped church basement where 43 children had huddled in terrified silence while gunfire echoed through Sarajevo's streets. "What do you mean?" Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Alessandro, what's happened?" Alessandro opened his mouth to explain about the bullet, the photograph, Benedetti's thinly veiled threats, but the words died in his throat as his office door burst open without ceremony. His secretary, Elena, stood in the doorway, her usually composed face flushed with something between excitement and terror. "Your Eminence," she said breathlessly, "there's a woman here. She says she's from Sarajevo. She's asking for you specifically, and she won't speak to anyone else." Security tried to redirect her through proper channels, but she showed them something that made them call upstairs immediately. Alessandro's blood turned to ice water. "Marcus, I'll call you back," he said into the phone, ending the connection before his old friend could respond. "What did she show them?" Alessandro asked, though he dreaded the answer. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice. "A photograph, Your Eminence. Security wouldn't tell me what was in it, but Captain Richter looked like he'd seen a ghost. He said to tell you the visitor claims she was 12 years old when you saved her life." The office seemed to tilt around Alessandro. 12 years old, one of the children from the basement. His mind raced through faces from that night. Dirty, terrified children pressed against stone walls while their world exploded above them. How many had been 12? 3? 4? He tried so hard to forget their individual features, to let them blur into a collective memory that felt less personal, less devastating. "Where is she now?" Alessandro managed. "Conference room 3. Captain Richter insisted on a secure location." Elena hesitated. "Your Eminence, should I cancel your morning appointments?" Alessandro looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking. The bullet in his pocket felt radioactive now, burning against his chest like a brand. Someone from that basement had grown up, tracked him down, and brought evidence to the Vatican's doorstep. The careful walls he'd built around that night were crumbling in real time. "Yes," he said quietly. "Cancel everything." Elena nodded and withdrew, leaving Alessandro alone with the weight of 30 years' worth of chickens coming home to roost. He walked to his private bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, pale, haunted, stripped of the diplomatic composure that had become his armor. When he emerged, he found Captain Richter waiting in his office. The Swiss guard's usual stoic expression had been replaced by something Alessandro had never seen before: uncertainty. "Your Eminence," Richter said formally, "the visitor has requested complete privacy for your conversation. No recordings, no security presence. She says what she has to discuss concerns matters of confession." "Confession?" Alessandro's voice cracked slightly. "She used that word specifically?" "Yes, sir. She also asked me to give you this." Richter extended a small object wrapped in white cloth. Alessandro unwrapped it with trembling fingers, revealing a child's wooden cross, the kind distributed to refugee families by aid organizations. The wood was worn smooth by decades of handling, and carved into the back in a child's unsteady handwriting were the letters A.T. Alessandro's legs nearly gave out. He remembered now. A little girl with dark braids who'd clung to his cassock during the worst of the shelling. She'd given him a drawing, asked him to keep it safe. He'd promised to return it when the war ended. But in the chaos of evacuation and the horror of what followed, he'd lost track of her. Of all of them. She kept it, he whispered, more to himself than to Richter. Sir? Alessandro looked up, feeling as though he was surfacing from deep water. Nothing, Captain. Please escort me to Conference Room 3. As they walked through the Vatican's marble corridors, Alessandro's mind reeled with possibilities. Had she seen something that night? Did she know about the massacre, about his silence, about the choice he'd made to protect them all by protecting himself? Or was this simply a survivor seeking closure, carrying childhood gratitude into adulthood? The wooden cross felt impossibly heavy in his palm. With each step toward Conference Room 3, Alessandro understood that whatever waited behind that door would shatter the life he'd carefully constructed. The bullet had been a warning, a signal that the past was stirring, but this was the past itself, walking through his doors with the face of innocence he'd tried so desperately to save. There would be no returning to the safety of diplomatic silence after this moment. Alessandro paused outside Conference Room 3, his hand frozen on the brass door handle. Through the heavy wood he could hear nothing, no movement, no breathing, just the suffocating silence that had haunted his dreams for 30 years. The wooden cross burned in his palm like a coal from hell's own furnace. Your Eminence? Captain Richter's voice seemed to come from very far away. Alessandro nodded curtly and pushed open the door. The woman seated at the mahogany table was not the 12-year-old girl from his memories. She was perhaps 42 now, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that held depths Alessandro recognized, the particular darkness that came from witnessing too much, too young. She wore a simple black dress and no jewelry except for a thin gold chain around her neck. When she looked up at him, Alessandro's breath caught. Those eyes. He remembered them peering up at him from the church basement, wide with terror but somehow still trusting. Maria, he whispered before he could stop himself. Her smile was sharp as a blade. You remember. Good. Please sit down, Father. It's Cardinal now, Alessandro said automatically, then immediately regretted the correction. It sounded pompous, defensive. Cardinal, she repeated, tasting the word. Yes, you've done very well for yourself. Vatican Secretary of State, advisor to 3 popes, the Church's moral compass. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit, please. Alessandro lowered himself into the chair, hyper-aware of every sound. The leather creaking, his cassock rustling, his own ragged breathing. Maria studied him with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. You're wondering why I'm here, she said. Yes. Alessandro's voice cracked like an adolescent's. After all these years, 30 years, 4 months, and 6 days, Maria interrupted. I've been counting. The precision of her memory sent ice through Alessandro's veins. This wasn't a casual reunion. She'd been planning this, preparing. The bullet, had she sent it? But then why come herself? Maria, what happened to the children, all of you, after you abandoned us? Her voice remained conversational, but Alessandro flinched as if she'd struck him. Most of us survived, if that's what you're asking. Scattered across Europe, foster families, orphanages. The lucky ones found relatives in other countries. Alessandro's throat felt lined with sand. I didn't abandon you. The evacuation was 3 days after the massacre. Maria leaned forward slightly. 3 days we waited in that basement, listening to the screams from the field behind the church. 3 days wondering if you were coming back, if anyone was coming back. The room seemed to contract around Alessandro. He'd known the evacuation had been delayed, but 3 days? In his carefully constructed version of events, he'd always assumed it had been immediate, clean, surgical. The children had been saved, moved to safety, given new lives. He'd never allowed himself to imagine them waiting in that cold basement, hungry and terrified, while bodies rotted 50 meters away. I tried to get back, he said weakly. The roads were blocked, the shelling. You were in Rome within a week. Maria's voice cut through his excuses like a scythe. I know because I've been tracking your movements for 20 years. First assignment after Bosnia, Vatican Diplomatic Corps, fast-track promotion, no trauma counseling, No investigation into what happened at the church, almost as if someone wanted you quietly promoted and safely contained. Alessandro's hands began to shake. What are you saying? I'm saying someone has been protecting you, Father. Someone with enough power to bury reports, transfer files, make inconvenient questions disappear. Maria reached into her purse and withdrew a manila envelope. Someone who's been very, very careful to keep your secret. She slid the envelope across the table. Alessandro stared at it as if it were a live grenade. Open it, she said gently. With trembling fingers, Alessandro lifted the envelope's flap. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, the massacre site from multiple angles, close-ups of faces he recognized, and there, in the corner of one image, a figure in priest's robes, watching from behind a half-destroyed wall, watching, not helping, not trying to stop it, just watching. You weren't just silent, Maria said softly. You were complicit. You knew it was going to happen. Alessandro's vision blurred. The photographs scattered from his nerveless fingers, falling to the conference table like autumn leaves. Each image was a nail in his coffin, irrefutable proof of the choice he'd made that night. Protect the children by letting others die. Who else knows? He whispered. Maria's smile held no warmth. That's the wrong question, Father. The right question is, what are you willing to do to keep it secret? The wooden cross fell from Alessandro's palm, clattering onto the mahogany table between them like a judgment rendered. Alessandro stared at the wooden cross lying between them, its carved edges catching the fluorescent light like accusations made manifest. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by the distant tolling of church bells marking the hour, 9 o'clock, though it felt like his entire world had aged decades in the span of minutes. What do you want from me? His voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. Maria gathered the scattered photographs with methodical precision, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Do you know what happened to Father Costas? She asked, not looking up from her task. The name hit Alessandro like a physical blow. Costas? He was evacuated, transferred back to Athens, I assumed. You assumed wrong. Maria's fingers paused over a particularly damning image. Alessandro's robed figure clearly visible in the background, while uniformed men herded civilians toward the tree line. Father Costas tried to stop it. When he realized what was happening, when he saw you standing there doing nothing, he broke from cover, started shouting, trying to warn them. Alessandro's chest constricted. In his memories, Costas had simply vanished between one moment and the next, there one day and gone the next morning. He'd convinced himself the older priest had been reassigned, pulled out by his superiors for safety. They shot him first, Maria continued, her voice clinical now, reporting facts. Single bullet to the head, made the others watch. Then they asked you directly, should they continue? No. The word tore from Alessandro's throat. That's not, I never... You nodded. Maria finally looked up, her dark eyes holding nothing but cold certainty. The photographer captured it, frame by frame. Costas falling, the commander turning to you, you looking back toward the church where we children were hidden, then nodding once. A simple business transaction. Their lives for ours. The conference room spun around Alessandro. He gripped the table's edge until his knuckles went white, fighting waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. Because somewhere in the deepest, most carefully buried part of his memory, he could almost see it, that moment of terrible calculation when survival instinct overrode everything else. 47 people, Maria said, stacking the photographs into a neat pile. That's how many died so that 43 children could live. The mathematics seemed reasonable at the time, didn't they? More saved than lost. Alessandro's vision blurred. You don't understand. The situation, it was chaos, everything happening so fast. Oh, but I do understand. Maria opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a thick sheaf of documents. Because I've spent 20 years understanding. University degree in international relations. Master's thesis on war crimes documentation. PhD dissertation specifically on civilian casualties in the Bosnian conflict. She smiled without warmth. I made myself an expert on what happened to us, Father. All of us. The papers she spread across the table were copies, official reports, witness statements, military communications. Alessandro recognized some of the letterheads: UN Peacekeeping Forces, International War Crimes Tribunal, NATO intelligence assessments, all stamped with classifications, dates, case numbers. The fascinating thing, Maria continued, is how systematically the evidence disappeared. Witness statements that were filed but never processed. Military reports that somehow got lost in bureaucratic shuffles. Even the original photographer, a Reuters journalist named David Kellerman, died in a car accident 6 months after the war ended. Very tragic, very convenient. Alessandro's hands trembled as he reached for one of the documents, then pulled back as if the paper might burn him. "Someone's been covering it up," he whispered. "Someone with tremendous power. Someone who recognized your potential early and decided you were worth protecting." Maria leaned back in her chair, studying his face with scientific interest. "The question that's haunted me for decades is whether you knew, whether you were actively complicit in the cover-up or just a useful pawn who happened to benefit from someone else's chess game." The wooden cross seemed to pulse with malevolent life between them. Alessandro could barely breathe through the weight pressing down on his chest, not just guilt now, but a growing horror at the implications. If Maria was right, if someone had been systematically protecting him all these years, then his entire career, his position, everything he'd accomplished had been built on a foundation of purchased silence. "The bullet," he managed. "Did you send it?" Maria shook her head. "No, Father. That came from someone else entirely. Someone who wants you to confess, to bring everything into the light." Her smile turned predatory. "But I'm not interested in your confession. I want something much more valuable." Alessandro stared at her, too afraid to ask the question that was forming in his mind. "I want you to help me find who's been protecting you," Maria said softly. "Because whoever buried this evidence, whoever's kept you safe all these years, they're the real monster in this story, and they're still out there, still making decisions about who lives and who dies." The bells of St. Peter's began to chime again, marking the half-hour, and with each note, Alessandro felt another piece of his carefully constructed world crumble into dust. Alessandro's mind reeled as he stared at Maria across the conference table, her words echoing in the sterile air like a judgment pronounced from on high. The real monster, someone who'd been pulling strings for 30 years, orchestrating his rise through the church hierarchy while burying evidence of mass murder. "I don't understand," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, fragments of memory began shifting into new, terrible patterns. Who would have that kind of power, that kind of reach? Maria's smile was razor-thin. "Think, Father. Who knew you were in Bosnia? Who had access to your personnel files? Who could influence Vatican assignments?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Who stood the most to gain from having a Secretary of State carrying such a devastating secret? The blood drained from Alessandro's face as understanding crashed over him like a collapsing wall. 30 years of carefully orchestrated promotions, assignments that had seemed like divine providence at the time, doors that opened just when he needed them most, and always, always, the gentle guidance of one particular mentor who'd taken a special interest in his career. "Cardinal Benedetti," he breathed. "Your predecessor as Secretary of State," Maria confirmed. "The man who personally recommended you for every major position you've held. The man who discovered your diplomatic talents and fast-tracked your rise through the Vatican hierarchy." Alessandro's hands flew to his mouth as memories flooded back with sickening clarity. Benedetti appearing at his hospital bedside in Rome, bringing news of his reassignment before Alessandro had even reported what happened in Bosnia. The older cardinal's fatherly concern, his insistence that Alessandro not dwell on the trauma, that the church needed his talents elsewhere. How Benedetti had personally handled all the paperwork, all the debriefings, ensuring Alessandro never had to give detailed testimony about his final days in Sarajevo. "He knew," Alessandro whispered. "From the beginning, he knew what I'd done. More than that." Maria pulled out another document, a communication intercept marked with NATO intelligence stamps. Cardinal Benedetti wasn't just covering up your crime after the fact. He was the one who gave the order. The paper fluttered from Alessandro's nerveless fingers. The typewritten text swam before his eyes, but certain phrases leaped out like brands: asset in place, acceptable casualties for larger objective. Priest will comply to protect children. It was a trap, he gasped. The whole situation, he engineered it. The massacre was going to happen regardless, Maria said with clinical precision. But Benedetti saw an opportunity. A young, idealistic priest who could be broken just enough to become useful, but not so broken as to be unreliable. He needed someone in his debt, someone whose conscience he could control through carefully managed guilt. Alessandro remembered Benedetti's words from that hospital room 30 years ago. God works through our failures as well as our successes, my son. Sometimes our darkest moments become the foundation for our greatest service to the church. At the time, they'd seemed like spiritual comfort. Now they sounded like the gloating of a puppet master admiring his handiwork. Every decision I've made as Secretary of State, Alessandro said, the full horror dawning on him. Every diplomatic position, every policy recommendation, guided by your gratitude to the man who saved your career and your desperate need to atone for what you believed was your failure. Maria's voice held no sympathy. You've been the perfect asset, Father. Brilliant enough to be effective, guilty enough to be controlled. The conference room seemed to tilt around Alessandro as 30 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled into dust. His diplomatic triumphs, his moral authority within the church, his reputation as a man of unshakable principle, all of it built on a foundation of orchestrated blackmail and manufactured guilt. But Benedetti's dead, Alessandro said desperately, grasping for some anchor in the chaos. He died 3 years ago. If he was controlling me— Who do you think sent you the bullet? Maria interrupted, her eyes glittering with something that might have been satisfaction. Alessandro's world stopped spinning and simply shattered. Someone inherited Benedetti's files, she continued relentlessly. Someone found his insurance policy, probably detailed records of exactly how he controlled you, complete with evidence of the massacre. And now they want something from you. Something important enough to risk exposing the whole conspiracy. Alessandro thought of the ornate silver bullet sitting in his desk drawer, its engraved message that had seemed like a death threat but now revealed itself as something far more insidious. A changing of the guard. New puppet master, same strings. The question is, Maria said, standing and gathering her documents with practiced efficiency, are you going to keep dancing to their tune, or are you finally ready to cut yourself free? She paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. The children you saved that night. We all grew up believing you were a hero who sacrificed everything to protect us. It's almost poetic that you might actually become one, 30 years too late. The door closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid falling shut. Alessandro remained frozen in his chair long after the sound of Maria's footsteps faded down the corridor. The conference room felt like a tomb, sterile, airless, filled with the stench of his own decomposing illusions. The wooden cross lay where it had fallen, its carved surface now seeming to mock every prayer he'd ever uttered, every blessing he'd ever given. Someone inherited Benedetti's files. The words circled his mind like vultures. 3 years ago, when Cardinal Benedetti had suffered his fatal heart attack, Alessandro had felt genuine grief. The man had been his mentor, his protector, the closest thing to a father he'd had since entering the priesthood. He delivered the eulogy himself, speaking movingly of Benedetti's wisdom, his dedication to the church's mission, his gentle guidance of younger clergy. All lies, or rather, all truth viewed through a lens so distorted that reality had become unrecognizable. Alessandro forced himself to stand on unsteady legs and walk to the window overlooking the courtyard. Evening shadows stretched across the ancient stones, and he could see tourists still wandering the grounds, taking photographs, marveling at centuries of accumulated holiness. What would they think if they knew that one of the church's highest-ranking officials had been dancing like a marionette for 3 decades, his strings pulled by a master manipulator who'd orchestrated mass murder for the sake of creating the perfect asset? But who had those strings now? Alessandro's mind raced through possibilities. Benedetti's personal secretary, Father Torino, had died in a climbing accident 8 months after the cardinal's funeral. The timing seemed less coincidental now. Benedetti's nephew, a lawyer in Milan who'd handled the estate, but he was a secular man with no apparent connection to Vatican politics. The cardinal's housekeeper, Sister Maria Celeste, but she was 78 and had taken a vow of silence upon entering a contemplative order, unless... The thought struck him like lightning. Benedetti's archives. As Secretary of State, the cardinal had maintained extensive private files, correspondence, policy papers, diplomatic cables that never made it into official church records. When Benedetti died, those files had been transferred to a secure storage facility, pending review by the Vatican Secret Archives. The review process could take decades. In the meantime, access was restricted to a handful of senior officials. Officials like Cardinal Francesco Navarro, Benedetti's former deputy who now oversaw the Vatican's external communications, or Monsignor Heinrich Kaufmann, the German prelate who managed sensitive diplomatic correspondence, or even Archbishop Sarah Chen, the rising star in Vatican finances, who'd been granted special access to historical financial documents for her restructuring initiatives. Any one of them could have discovered Benedetti's insurance policy. Any one of them could have realized the power that came with controlling the Vatican's Secretary of State. Alessandro's reflection in the window showed him a man he barely recognized, hollow-eyed, gray-faced, aged years in the span of hours. But beneath the devastation, something else was crystallizing. Something that felt dangerously like resolve. Maria was right about one thing. He could continue dancing to his new puppet master's tune, trading his conscience and agency for the illusion of security. Or he could finally cut himself free. But freedom would come at a price that made his knees weak. Confession would destroy not just his own career, but potentially destabilize the church itself. The Vatican Secretary of State revealed as complicit in mass murder. The scandal would reverberate for generations. And yet, Alessandro thought of Father Costas, the elderly priest whose only crime had been trying to save innocent lives. In his carefully edited memories, Costas had simply disappeared, but Maria's photographs had shown the truth. A decent man executed for refusing to be complicit in atrocity, while Alessandro had stood by and watched. How many other decent people had died over the years because Alessandro had been too compromised to speak truth to power? How many policy decisions had he made or influenced based not on moral conviction, but on the subtle pressure of managed guilt? How many times had Benedetti guided him toward positions that served not the church's mission, but some deeper, darker agenda? The silver bullet in his desk drawer wasn't just a threat or a summons. It was an opportunity. Someone wanted him to confess, to bring everything into the light. Perhaps they intended to destroy him in the process, but perhaps destruction was exactly what he deserved. Alessandro pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment, trembling with the weight of what he was about to set in motion. Then he pressed dial. Monsignor Reeves? This is Cardinal Torretti. I need to schedule an urgent private audience with His Holiness. Tomorrow morning, if possible. He paused, watching his reflection steady in the darkening window. Tell him I have a confession to make. The point of no return rushed up to meet him like the ground beneath a falling man, and Alessandro discovered he was no longer afraid of the impact. The call connected after 3 rings. Your Eminence, came Monsignor Reeves's crisp British accent, tinged with surprise at hearing from the Secretary of State so late in the evening. Of course, His Holiness has morning prayers at 6, but I believe his schedule is clear from 8:30 onward. Shall I? 8:30 would be perfect, Alessandro said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. And Monsignor, this conversation remains absolutely confidential. No one else is to know about this meeting. A pause. Understood, Your Eminence. Alessandro ended the call and set the phone on the conference table beside the scattered remnants of his former life. The silence that followed felt different now, not the oppressive weight of secrets, but the hollow echo of a man who had finally stopped running from the truth. He gathered Maria's photographs with hands that no longer trembled, studying each image with the clarity of someone seeing properly for the first time in 30 years. The faces of the executed civilians stared back at him. Men, women, elderly grandparents who had trusted in the protection of the church, in trusting him. The walk back to his office felt like a pilgrimage through his own purgatory. The Vatican's corridors, usually alive with the quiet bustle of evening prayers and administrative duties, seemed to hold their breath. Swiss guards nodded respectfully as he passed, their halberds catching the warm glow of ancient sconces. How many of these devoted men would still offer him that same respect tomorrow evening? In his private study, Alessandro opened the desk drawer and withdrew the silver bullet. Under the lamplight, the engraved lettering seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Cardinal Alessandro Toretti, truth has a price. He turned it over in his palm, feeling its weight. Not just the physical heft of precious metal, but the accumulated gravity of 3 decades worth of lies. His desk phone rang. The caller ID showed an internal Vatican extension, but one he didn't recognize. Alessandro stared at the blinking light for several rings before lifting the receiver. "I was wondering when you'd finally call His Holiness," said a voice he knew intimately, one that had guided him through countless diplomatic crises, offered comfort during his darkest moments of doubt, and shaped nearly every major decision of his career. Cardinal Navarro. Alessandro's blood turned to ice water. "I thought you were attending the conference in Geneva." A soft chuckle. "I flew back this afternoon. Remarkable timing, wouldn't you say? Just as you were having such an illuminating conversation with our Bosnian friend." The warmth in Navarro's voice, the paternal affection Alessandro had treasured for years, now sounded like acid. "Poor Benedetti always said you were too sentimental for this work, too prone to conscience. You sent the bullet." "I inherited much more than Benedetti's files when he died, Alessandro. I inherited his responsibilities, his vision for the Church's future, his carefully cultivated assets." Papers rustled in the background. "Did you really think you were the only one? That 30 years of perfect manipulation was the work of amateur puppeteers?" Alessandro's office seemed to spin around him as the final pieces clicked into place. Navarro hadn't simply discovered Benedetti's conspiracy. He'd been part of it from the beginning. How many other ranking church officials carried similar secrets? How many policy decisions had been shaped not by spiritual conviction, but by a shadow network of controlled guilt and manufactured shame? "The Church deserves better," Alessandro said, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. "The Church deserves to survive," Navarro corrected sharply. "Do you have any idea how much good we've accomplished through our guided leadership? How many conflicts we've prevented? How many negotiations we've influenced toward peace? Your diplomatic successes weren't accidents, Alessandro. They were the product of men willing to bear necessary sins for a greater purpose." "Necessary sins?" Alessandro laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call 47 innocent people murdered for the sake of creating your perfect asset? I call it investment in the future. Those people were going to die regardless. We simply ensured their deaths served a higher purpose." Navarro's voice carried the calm certainty of absolute conviction. "Just as your confession tomorrow will serve our purposes, whether you realize it or not." The words hit Alessandro like a physical blow. "What? Did you think I would simply let you destroy everything we've built? Your meeting with His Holiness has been anticipated, prepared for. By tomorrow evening, Cardinal Alessandro Toretti will be dead, a tragic suicide brought on by overwhelming guilt over wartime trauma. The Church will mourn a brilliant diplomat driven to madness by the burdens of his service." Alessandro's hand found the silver bullet, its surface now warm from his palm. Through his office window, he could see lights beginning to twinkle across Rome, millions of faithful souls looking to the Vatican for moral guidance. They deserved leaders who served God, not puppet masters who orchestrated atrocities for political advantage. "You're wrong about one thing, Francesco," Alessandro said quietly. "My conscience isn't a weakness." He hung up the phone and began to write. Alessandro wrote with the meticulous precision that had made him legendary in diplomatic circles, but this time he served only truth. Every detail of that night in Sarajevo, Benedetti's orchestration of the massacre, Navarro's inheritance of the conspiracy, the silver bullet that had arrived not as threat, but as summons from his new puppet master. He sealed the confession in 3 separate envelopes, one for the Holy Father, one for the Vatican Secretary of Communications, and one for Cardinal Martinez at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Each would receive their copy simultaneously at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, too late for Navarro to intercept them all. Too early for anyone to claim Alessandro had been driven mad by guilt. As dawn painted Rome's ancient stones in shades of gold and amber, Alessandro walked through the Vatican gardens one final time, the same paths where he'd once strolled with visiting diplomats, weighing words that would shape international policy, the same benches where he'd sat in quiet contemplation, believing himself to be wrestling with God's will rather than dancing to a dead man's strings. Near the fountain where he'd first read the Psalms as a young seminarian, Alessandro found the peace that had eluded him for 30 years. Not the peace of absolution, that was beyond his reach now, but the harder-won tranquility of a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. His phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from Navarro. Demands to know where he was, orders to report to his office immediately. Finally, threats thinly veiled as paternal concern. Alessandro deleted each one without reading it fully. At 7:30, he returned to his office to find 2 Swiss guards waiting in the corridor. Their faces remained professionally neutral, but Alessandro caught the subtle tension in their posture. Navarro's final gambit, declaring the Secretary of State mentally unstable perhaps, or claiming he'd made threats against the Holy Father. "Your Eminence," the senior guard said respectfully, "Cardinal Navarro requests your immediate presence in the Apostolic Palace." "Of course he does." Alessandro smiled with surprising gentleness. "But I'm afraid I have a prior engagement with His Holiness." The guards exchanged glances. Their orders had clearly anticipated resistance, but Alessandro's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle them more than ranting would have. "Perhaps you could escort me there," Alessandro suggested. "After all, we wouldn't want any misunderstandings." The walk through the Vatican's corridors felt like a funeral procession, his own. Staff members who normally greeted him with warm familiarity now averted their eyes, confirming that word of his instability had already begun circulating. Navarro was thorough, Alessandro had to grant him that. They found Navarro himself waiting outside the papal apartments, flanked by 2 additional guards and wearing the expression of a man prepared for unpleasant duty. His face brightened with false relief as Alessandro approached. "Thank God," Navarro said loudly enough for witnesses to hear. "Alessandro, when you didn't respond to my calls, I feared, well, after yesterday's episode, we were all concerned for your well-being." "How thoughtful." Alessandro's voice carried the serenity of a man beyond manipulation. "Though I assure you, my mind has never been clearer." Navarro's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Around them, Vatican staff had begun gathering, drawn by some institutional instinct that recognized history unfolding. Alessandro could see in their faces the same hunger for righteousness that had once driven him to priesthood, before compromise and manipulation had slowly corroded his soul. At precisely 8 o'clock, the papal apartment's ornate doors opened, and Monsignor Reeves emerged with the measured dignity befitting the Holy Father's secretary. "His Holiness will see Cardinal Torretti now," Reeves announced. Navarro stepped forward. "Perhaps I should accompany—" "The Cardinal requested a private audience," Reeves interrupted with gentle firmness. "His Holiness has honored that request." Alessandro saw Navarro's carefully constructed facade crack for just an instant, a flash of genuine panic at losing control of his asset at the crucial moment. Then the mask slammed back into place, but it was too late. Alessandro had glimpsed the frightened man beneath the manipulator's confidence. "Of course," Navarro said smoothly. "We'll wait here for you, Alessandro." Alessandro paused at the threshold and turned back to face the corridor full of witnesses, guards, staff, and his soon-to-be former co-conspirator. These people deserved to serve a church that stood for something more than political expedience and manufactured guilt. "Francesco," he said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the hushed space. "I want you to know, I forgive you." The papal apartment's doors closed behind him with the finality of a man stepping from shadow into light. Inside, the Holy Father waited with infinite patience and eyes that already knew the weight of the confession about to reshape their church forever.